Professor Allan Lichtman. Professor, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've spent decades studying American politics and, predicting elections. What originally drew you to this history as your lens for understanding democracy?
I was brought up by very politically aware parents who always believed in the importance of understanding and knowledge. That's also very critical to the Jewish tradition. Jews survived literally millennia of persecution, right, in part because of their knowledge, their learning, their ability to somehow evade attempts to wipe them out.
Absolutely.
And so that stuck with me. Then I was at Brandeis University in the 1960s, and you could imagine a hotbed of political activism. So my interest in politics and indeed in improving the world goes all the way back to my earliest years.
Over the years, you've been a voice of dissent, especially in the mainstream narrative. How has that outsider perspective shaped your scholarship and the way you write, all of your books, especially this new one?
I've always believed in challenging the conventional wisdom and developing your own ideas and your own forms of expression. Way back in high school, I was captain of the Stuyvesant High School debate team. In fact, we established debate in the New York City public school system. And debate teaches you, above all, critical thinking and persuasive speaking. And I always felt you don't make your mark on the world. You don't influence the world. You don't reshape the world just by going along with the crowd. You've got to be able to develop something unique, new, different, that moves the conversation and doesn't just drone along with it. It can be a very lonely road, but that's the road I've taken.
Since your release of your new book, you argue that conservatism itself, and not just Trumpism, is at the core of America's authoritarian drift. I was wondering if you can unpack that idea for our listeners, because we've been dealing with this drift probably for decades, and now it's sort of they're taking their hoods off in a sense.
Well, they had their hoods on in the 1920s.
Yeah, right.
And this, I argue, is the first mistake made not just by commentators and opinion makers, but unfortunately by scholars. They misdate the rise of the American conservative movement, and that leads to a distorted view of what it's all about. If you don't get the history right, you're not going to get the present right, are you? So they think, modern conservatism begins maybe with William F. Buckley's 1955 introduction of the National Review, or Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign. In fact, I prove in this book, and it's also a theme of my earlier book, White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement, that was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in general nonfiction, all nonfiction books published. In fact, conservatism debate begins in its modern form decades before that. It begins right after World War I, in a reaction against, in part, Woodrow Wilson's policies, but more fundamentally, a reaction against the arrival on our shores of immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, heavily Jewish, heavily Catholic, the migration of Black people from the South to the northern cities, and the deep economic depression that follows World War I. Virtually every aspect of modern American conservatism can be found right after World War I. Do we have amnesia? Do we forget 3 of our most conservative presidents were elected after World War I? Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. No, there was no conservatism till William Buckley discovered it. Are you kidding me? It's unbelievable. And look what they did. Many of the same things we see conservatives doing today. Big tax cuts, major deregulation, the first draconian immigration restriction law that kept out Asians entirely and kept out almost all Southern and Eastern Europeans, the beginnings of the drug war, the war against pornography, the attacks on homosexuality. Are you saying this was invented, decades later? And so it's critical to understand the origins. Second thing, and in many ways, this is my biggest contribution. You've got to cut through what conservatives profess to be their ideals and what is actually their immutable core principles. Here I learned a lot from the late, great epistemologist Imre Lakatos. And he talks about scientific programs, which are perfectly applicable to political programs. And he says, there is a core to every political or scientific program that's immutable, that's fundamental. And then it's surrounded by an outer belt of totally discardable, dispensable ideas solely designed to protect the inner core. And what I show is virtually everything, not just commentators and opinion makers, but sadly scholars too, presume represents in conservatism, doesn't at all. It's these outer belt, discardable principles. Let me give you a few examples. Limited government, right? Go back to prohibition, the biggest imposition of the heavy hand of government on America to that point. Look at what Donald Trump is doing with ICE, with the National Guard. Look at all the abortion restrictions. Look at their advocacy of a national right to life amendment, which would put the hand of government in our bedrooms all over the country. Fiscal responsibility. What presidents have blown the biggest holes in the deficit? Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and of course, Donald Trump, as we just saw in the last few months, his big, beautiful bill, right? Blowing at least a $3 trillion hole in the deficit. Personal morality and responsibility. Need I say anything about Donald Trump and his morality and his discarding of personal responsibility? Free enterprise. What have Republicans been doing since the Fordney-McCumber tariffs of the 20s, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, and all of Donald Trump's tariffs? Tariffs are the biggest imposition that you could put on free markets and free enterprise. And add to that business-friendly laws, special tax breaks, subsidies, loan guarantees, Donald Trump taking a piece of Intel. All of this is violative of free enterprise. And I need not even go into law and order, the Harding Teapot Dome scandals, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Trump being a 34 convicted felon. So what are conservatives really all about? What have they been about for 100 years since the end of World War II? Two things that this outer belt protects. Number one, advancing the interests of private, not free enterprise. All these things that I've talked about, including, I haven't mentioned, anti-union laws, right, anti-union initiatives, all go to the benefit of private enterprise, particularly the big tax cuts and the deregulation, the tariffs, the loans, the subsidies, none of which have anything to do with free markets or free enterprise. Second thing that they are really for is their own narrow, distorted view of traditional Christian, or sometimes they call it Christian Judeo teachings. Mike Johnson says, you want to know what I believe, what my worldview is, or my politics are? Just pick up a Bible. Well, when they look at the Bible, they find the most fringe, the least central parts of either Jesus's teachings or my tradition, Judaic teachings, focusing on things that are barely even mentioned or only by inference: abortion, gender identity, deviant sexuality. And they ignore the great bulk of teachings which warn about the dangers of greed and wealth. It was Jesus who said, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. They ignore the teachings on fidelity to truth, on caring for the poor, the vulnerable, and the sojourner. And all of their culture wars are aimed at these fringe elements. In other words, what's really going on here is their politics dictates their religion, not their religion shaping their politics.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't have put it better. It's almost as if they tell a great story, and it's almost like a folk tale of this like very small government style of politics. And 100 years ago, they've pretty much never changed.
No,
So,
and it's all in my book, Conservative at the Core, A New History of American Conservatism. And no one, as far as I know, has probed conservatism in exactly this way. It really is, and I believe, a unique contribution. An early review by the very respected Library Journal said, highly recommended for anyone interested in American politics or history. And of course, as I always am, I'm being attacked from the
yeah.
right. Yeah. With my recent commentary, I've gotten death threats. I've
Oh, I'm
all
sure.
kinds of anti-Semitic attacks. People claim my hair is a wig and I'm a joke.
Oh man.
I've been doxxed. I've been swatted. Twice we've had people try to break into my house. So, kind of being a maverick and being willing to say what you think,
Yeah.
it's not without consequences. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Especially now in this polarized world, and I'm sure
It's really sad.
it is. I guess I would add, do you think that your commentary on American conservatism is unique to conservatism in America, or do you think there's like any parallels to conservatism in other Western nations? Like, do you see a difference between those?
Oh, I'm not an expert on conservatism elsewhere, but I know a good bit about it. And these are hallmarks of conservatism. If you go back to the Nazi regime or the regime of the fascists in Italy, what did they forge? They forged a symbiotic relationship with big business. Big business was always a critical element. And it was certainly not free enterprise in those countries. It was a very close symbiotic relationship between the authoritarian governments and business, and authoritarians throughout history. You can go back, to even, before the Common Era. Authoritarians have always claimed, divine sanction for what they're doing. Something that gives them carte blanche to do whatever they want. Once you say God or the divinity or wherever you worship at the time is on your side, that is kind of a license to do whatever you want. And Trump has been open about that. He has said, as president, I can do anything I want. We haven't heard anything like that from a president since Richard Nixon, after his presidency, in a David Frost interview, basically said if the president does it, it's not illegal. And that sparked a huge backlash, not just from Democrats, but across the board.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of the one tweet put out by Donald Trump, that he who saves his country breaks no laws or whatever. I feel like it's very indicative of that.
Says I'm saving the country. He said that same thing now several times in different words. He's even said, long live the king. It reminds me of Louis XIV, the famous French tyrant king, who said, I am the state. That's basically what Trump thinks. And by the way, this is really important. Another error that's made is people say, oh, the Republicans in Congress always go along with Trump because they're afraid of him, right? That may be a small part of it, but they're missing the big picture. They go along with Trump because they agree with him. A big point of my book, and you pointed that out, is that Trump is not someone who hijacked conservatism. He is the culmination of conservatism. He came out of nowhere. He wasn't even on the pre-presidential ballots before 2015, when he burst out of
Yeah.
nowhere. Why? Because he articulated more boldly and more forthrightly core conservative principles than anyone else. So when they go along with him, it's because they agree with him. They're all part of the same system. Look, he got 90% of the conservative vote in 2024, a record, even beating the icon, the conservative icon, Ronald Reagan in his 1984 landslide. You know, every conservative in America, not just in Congress, but in the state legislatures and local government, have all lined up behind him. It's a little difficult to say, oh, he's not a real conservative, when every conservative is for him.
Speaking of Democratic backsliding in general, where do you think the U.S. stands compared to other countries in terms of authoritarian threats?
I think, unfortunately, we're at least maybe not in a 5-alarm fire, but at least a 3-alarm fire. And I think probably the closest analog would be Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's been lionized by Trump and other conservatives. They invited him as a treasured guest to their conference. And the hallmark of Orban in Hungary is indeed to invoke, religion and culture in support of his authoritarianism, to combat the free press, to go after his political enemies, and to build a military and police force loyal to him. All of those things we're now seeing in Donald Trump. You know, one of the most frightening things is what's really behind the National Guard going into D.C. or L.A. and maybe other cities. It has nothing to do with fighting crime. You know, Trump had to fabricate crime statistics to justify it. Sending in troops cannot fight crime, maybe temporarily, but they can leave. And all of the underlying causes of crime will still be there. It has nothing to do with fighting crime. It has to do with imposing his authority on the nation. And he is now building an unprecedented, enormous national police force. You know, these rapid deployment units of the National Guard, an enormously expanded immigration, customs, and enforcement. By far the biggest national police force we've ever seen, accountable to no one but Trump himself. A hallmark of authoritarianism is to have unaccountable police and military.
As the days go on, obviously something new happens, right? But I feel like the Democratic backsliding just keeps getting worse and worse by the hour. And I feel like eventually, once November of 2026 comes around, I don't know. I feel like MAGA is going to make a crazy move. I mean, we saw what happened in the Caribbean with the Venezuelan boat that apparently had a bunch of drugs on it. And again, we don't know for sure. Like the thing is, there wasn't proper due process. They just bombed a boat. I mean, it totally violated international law.
Arguably violated American law too.
Yeah,
That's a little murkier. He didn't go to Congress. He didn't have authorization. He didn't have a declaration. This was an extrajudicial execution, as you say, with no due process and no one's say-so but Donald Trump's. We don't even know if they really had drugs on that boat, because once you blow it to smithereens, you destroy all the evidence. The lawful thing to do is, if you suspect illegal drugs are being carried, you interdict the boat and you seize the drugs and you prosecute the perpetrators. You know, we had these enormous warships there. There's a little boat with 11 people on it. Are you telling me we couldn't stop that boat, board it, and arrest the 11 people? What a joke. But this is what's really behind this, again, is Donald Trump saying, I can do anything I want. No one's going to stop me. And the thing that really worries me, you put your finger on it, is the 2026 election, is this extrajudicial killing, this use of National Guard by just Trump unilaterally saying it's a national emergency. Is that a prelude to the use of the military and ICE at the polling places in 2026? He's already tried to wipe out mail-in voting.
Yeah, that too.
I've studied vote. I wrote a whole book about voting called The Embattled Vote in America, from the founding of the press. The vote has always been embattled. It's always been in question. And one thing we know from studying the history of the vote is whenever you put any kind of barrier in the way of voting, even though you're not actually denying someone the vote, right? But you're making it more difficult, then voting to participation plummets. It's human nature. You make something more difficult, right, you're less likely to do it.
The average I guess the average conservative American, they don't really see themselves as authoritarians, right? And we've talked about that. But yet again, they support policies and leaders that erode democracy itself. So why do you think that contradiction persists? And why does it keep getting worse?
Yeah, one of the reasons it gets worse is the digital world. And I think there are two elements of that. One element is the digital world doesn't bring us together. It does the opposite. It divides us. It puts us into these impenetrable bubbles of other like-minded people. And the algorithms reinforce that. You don't make money through diversity. You make money by catering to what people already think and already believe. And those bubbles are pretty much impervious to any kind of outside information. Oh, if anything contradicts what we think, that's the left, that's the lunatics, that's the commies, that's Biden. We don't even have to pay any attention to it. The other thing about the new digital world is it is massively subject to disinformation. After 40 years of being right in predicting presidential election results, I missed 2024. And I attributed that to two things. One, the tremendous mess up of the Democrats, of which I was very critical at the time, bashing unmercifully their own elected president, elected nominee. You never see the Republicans doing anything like that. And then secondly, the misinformation, spearheaded by the richest person in the world. According to press reports, 2 billion people viewed his misinformation. Let me give you one example. Abortion. If you read the exit polls, the pro-choice position beats the pro-life position by over 30 points. 30 points, 35 points. That should have powered Harris to a landslide win. But there was so much disinformation about abortion that when you look at the difference between Harris and Trump, it's not 30 points, it's not 20 points, it's not 10 points, it's not even 5 points, it's 3 points, 49, 46. Even if it had been 10 points, less than a third of the gap, she would have won in a landslide.
When I know, like Elon Musk, by his own admission, I believe he said in a post on Twitter that I guess without his help, I believe he said the Senate would have been 51-49 in favor of the GOP. Dems likely would have won the House, and Harris likely would have won the presidency. So, I mean, I do think it's very telling. He bought the platform, and obviously I would argue that he put his own spin on the platform.
Yeah, it was always
I'm sure it had a massive impact on that election.
People, not just the abortion issue, that alone should have decided the election. But they were misinformed about everything, thinking, inflation was in the double digits when it was below 3%, thinking we had record unemployment when it was down around 4%, almost record low, thinking immigrants were out to kill you when in fact they have the lowest crime rate. So there was thinking crime was soaring when it was dropping sharply. So, my keys to the White House are based upon the idea that a rational, pragmatic electorate makes a practical decision about whether the incumbent party should get 4 more years. But you can't make rational decisions when you are being overwhelmed by misinformation. And, I've been attacked for being wrong. That's fine. I admitted I was wrong. I was the first one to call Trump's victory on our show. But the important thing is not whether Lichtman is wrong or not, but the lesson that you learn from why the keys didn't work this time.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, you've been right. 10 different times, and you're wrong once, and then you get canceled.
42 years, yeah. Longer than the two of you have been alive.
Yeah, right, exactly. Many decades. And one time, it's just like, there's a hellfire rains down. It's ridiculous.
That's the way it goes. I expect it. I've been around a long time. I've seen everything. I don't even have a bucket list. I've done it all. And one thing I've learned, one from my wife and the other from myself, if you want to judge people, one thing you want to look at is how they treat women. That is so critically important. My wife, the great feminist, Karen Strickler, silver medalist in powerlifting, always reminds me of that. The other thing that I've learned from my own experience is how you treat everyone. That is, you treat, the janitor who cleans your office the same way you treat the president of the university. You treat everyone the same. And that's really important to me.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't agree more. But considering universities and academic institutions, what roles play in defending democracy at a time when they're under political attack?
That's why they're under political attack, because at their best, and I think most universities mirror this, they are the guardians of the truth. Yes. And there is nothing more corrosive of authoritarianism than the truth. Look at George Orwell's 1984. Yes, part of the reason Big Brother was able to maintain control was by force, the boot in the face. But even more important was something called doublethink, the destruction of truth. So war is peace, famine is plenty, hate is love. The great late political philosopher Hannah Arendt said, you lose truth, you lose everything. That's why Trump is waging such a relentless war against colleges, universities, and even K-12 education. And it's going on in the States as well. It's not just Trump, because they do not want the pursuit of truth. They want education to mirror their own politically driven orthodoxy. They want it to look like the 1776 project, which dozens of academic and scholarly organizations, virtually every important one in the country, signed on with the American Historical Association to say this is a mockery of history. It's nothing to do with what historians have learned and everything to do with Donald Trump's political agenda. That's what he wants. And that's what, hopefully the universities will continue to stand against. I certainly will.
If you had one, piece of advice you could give to young people concerned about the state of democracy or the state of government or authoritarianism in the United States, what would that piece of advice be?
I always go back to what the great educator Horace Mann once said. He said, be ashamed to die until you have won at least one small battle for humanity. Figure out as a young person, I don't care how small it is, figure out what battle you can fight for humanity. It may be having a podcast like this. It may be joining a demonstration. It may be writing an op-ed. It may be contacting your congressmen and senators, maybe organizing a get out the vote or organizing a demonstration. There's no royal road to making a difference, but figure out what small battle you can win and fight it.
Yeah, that's what we're doing right now.
Yes, you are. I'm very proud of you guys.
Yeah. Oh, God, dude, that means a lot. Yes, buy the new book,
It means
guys.
a lot to me if you buy my book.
Yes. But yeah, Professor, thanks so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we hope to have you on again at some point in the near future if, the First Amendment somehow gets wiped off the map. Who knows? Who knows at this point, right? So, but
take care.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.